Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it. For me, this is a very preliminary set of ideas. And I should also mention that the ideas in this paper are not, well, the ideas in this presentation are not exactly like the ideas in the paper, because I've organized them differently in order to hopefully get a little bit more clarity than the paper itself had. So for those of you who may have read the paper, don't be too surprised if I'm going out of order. So here's just a quick overview of what I want to say. Let's see, I have to move this little thing. Okay. So I'll talk about a conception of human nature that's due to evolutionary psychology. And then I'll introduce this particular hypothesis, BW, that there's a brain-based distinction to be found between evolved and acquired traits. I'll talk about one particular case that puts some pressure on that thesis. Then I'll talk about neural reuse or neuronal recycling, which is a sort of a general theory of neural architecture, and I'll give an argument that suggests that that thesis BW is incorrect. And then I'll try to draw out a conclusion about human nature, which entails that human nature couldn't be what at least standard versions of evolutionary psychology say that it is. There we go. Yeah, okay. So why am I talking about human nature? Sorry, why am I talking about evolutionary psychology? Did I miss a slide? Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. So before I sort of start the main part of the talk, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my motivation. And this might help with our discussion afterwards. So my big picture question is just, can we learn something about human nature from the organization or the structures in the human brain? You'll all probably be familiar with arguments that go in the other direction. There are many arguments that discuss what human nature is like given an evolutionary point of view, and then draw some conclusions about what the brain must be like in order to support that nature. And this is maybe not so surprising because the brain is pretty complicated and it's hard to study directly, and brain imaging technologies are relatively recent. But maybe now we have enough technology and enough data that we can say something substantive about what the brain architecture looks like and make some inferences from that architecture to theories of human nature. And I don't think too many people have talked about that. I mean, to some extent, back when connectionism became a big movement in the 1980s, people did talk about how human nature is more plastic than we may have previously supposed. But you know, that stuff wasn't really based on human brain architecture. It was more based on a mathematical theory of neural networks. Okay. So I'm talking about evolutionary psychology because, first of all, evolutionary psychology is committed to the existence of something like human nature, and it's a family of views that suppose that human nature, at least in part, corresponds to a set of adaptations that evolved in response to environmental problems. It evolved as a sort of set of solutions to environmental problems in an environment that might have looked a little bit like that. The environment is old. So people often talk about the Pleistocene as being old enough that there's been enough time since then for substantive genetic, evolution on genetic types to have occurred, but not so far back that there was nothing, no sophisticated cognition yet. So in the Pleistocene epoch, there was a selection regime, maybe involved collaborative hunting, foraging, various forms of social complexity, and genetic adaptations appeared to deal with that selection regime. And a lot of our contemporary cognitive and emotional dispositions reflect the solutions that natural selection and maybe other forces hit upon to deal with the Pleistocene past. Okay, here's a quick quote from Steven Pinker that just, I think, is kind of a standard and not terribly strong or implausibly strong version of what proponents of evolutionary psychology think about human nature. He says, I think we have a reason to believe that the mind is equipped with a battery of emotions, drives, and faculties for reasoning and communicating, and that they have a common logic across cultures, that they're difficult to erase or redesign from scratch, were shaped by natural selection, and owe some of their basic design to information in the genome. And the phrase that matters most for us is difficult to erase or redesign from scratch. Okay. So here's just kind of a very generic argument that summarizes some of the thinking that's common to the many different types of evolutionary psychology perspectives on human nature. First of all, the traits that comprise human nature must be old. They sort of appeared and became part of us a long time ago. And the traits that comprise human nature are canalized. That means they're developmentally robust. They will develop across a wide range of environmental and developmental conditions. So that corresponds to the part of Pinker's phrase that says difficult to erase or redesign from scratch. And I think that if you assume that the traits that comprise human nature are old and canalized, then it follows that the traits that comprise human nature are going to be shared with our genetically comparable ancestors. So people who lived, I don't know, maybe 35,000 years ago and perhaps more. And it follows from that the traits that compromise human nature cannot be recently acquired. Okay, so what does this have to do with the brain? Well, if the traits that compromise human nature cannot be traits that are recently acquired, like, I don't know, the ability to drive a car or something like that, then what is stopping these recently acquired traits from becoming part of our human nature? We acquire all kinds of novel traits, but they don't count as human nature, and there has to be something in our brains that makes that the case. There has to be some kind of barrier that protects the core human nature and doesn't allow it to be easily changed, erased, or modulated. Okay, so whatever that barrier is, you would think that it would have to exist in the brain, because the brain is what changes when we learn. Okay, so I'm going to offer you a hypothesis about how the brain might look if you assume that such a protective barrier exists. But I call it the bells and whistles hypothesis, and in case people are not familiar with this maybe strange English phrase, bells and whistles, I thought that I should just explain what that means. The phrase bells and whistles doesn't necessarily refer to bells and whistles literally, Rather, it refers to attractive but non-essential components added to a machine after the construction is finished. Okay. So here's how I've described the bells and whistles hypothesis, and this is a little different from the way I formulated it in the paper. So the bells and whistles hypothesis says that in the modern adult brain, so modern meaning the brains of modern people, we can distinguish between the fundamental neural architecture that we do share with our genetically comparable ancient ancestors and the distinctively modern architectural features that we have and they do not. Now, I don't know that anyone's defended this idea. I've never read anyone defending it, so I'm not pinning it on anyone. But it just seems like an interesting idea and one that might even be a requirement if the core traits that constitute human nature are going to be protected from interference by cultural transmission. Yeah, so that barrier image is a metaphor, of course, but I think maybe a useful one. Now, this hypothesis, I think, has at least the following two implications, which are worth drawing out. The first one is that neural architecture is somewhat modular. It can't be completely non-modular. If it were completely non-modular, then at least potentially every region would participate in every function. But of course, many brain functions in some broad sense of that term are modern and are culturally acquired. So that would mean that every region participates in functions that are modern and culturally acquired, and that's just obviously incompatible with the bells and whistles hypothesis. The second implication is that neural architecture has to be somewhat rigid. If it were completely plastic, then the modular structure that I just talked about wouldn't be preserved. It could be invaded or undermined or changed in some way by novel developmental environments. Okay, so I'm saying that the bells and whistles hypothesis is sort of it's a bold claim about how the core evolved bits of human nature get cordoned off or protected from the demands of the modern world and the novel developmental environments of the modern world. And I think that at the very least, evolutionary psychologists are committed to the idea that there is a genuine distinction between the traits we have that are old and the traits that are recently acquired. But as other people have talked about in the past, making distinctions like this in evolution is not so black and white. And in particular, you might wonder whether age is determinate or whether the age of a trait is somehow fuzzy. So let me just give you one example. Consider playing the piano. So in one sense, the capacity to play the piano is obviously a recent capacity because there were no pianos until recently. However, if we describe it, the capacity to play the piano in a very coarse-grained way, then maybe we can make it sound kind of ancient. Right? Maybe that is a capacity which is just a sum of two ancient capacities. One is sort of an evolved musical sensibility, which I don't know how old music is, but it's arguably even older than humans are. And then we have an evolved capacity for fine-grained manual dexterity. And you just put those two things together and you get piano playing. So in that sense, piano playing is old. Now, this, by the way, is is related. It's a variation on what Kim Sterelny and Paul Griffiths call the grain problem for evolutionary psychology, and they think it runs pretty deep. So I want to imagine what an evolutionary psychologist might say, in response to this problem, who wants to distinguish, who wants to be a realist sort of about the age of different psychological characteristics. So the response I'm imagining is that there could be, a taxonomy of traits where some psychological traits or characteristics are paradigmatically ancient ones, some are paradigmatically modern ones, and the vast majority of traits will be, fuzzy, and maybe we won't have sufficient knowledge to, say with much confidence whether they're ancient or modern, or maybe they're just a mix of both. But we should be able to find at least some examples where we've got, a good, clear case of an ancient trait and a good, clear case of a modern trait, and that's enough to show that, the view that human nature is ancient is not somehow incoherent. Okay, so the strategy I have in mind on behalf of the evolutionary psychologist is that we could identify pairs of traits of each of the two types, so really the sort of paradigmatically ancient and paradigmatically modern, and then try to figure out how those traits are realized in neural architecture, and then check whether there are any systematic differences between the way that those traits are realized, and on that basis, start to make some generalizations about how and whether the bells and whistles hypothesis could be true. Okay. So now I'd like to talk about a case that puts a little bit of pressure on that view. And this is a cherry-picked case. So I'm not supposing that this case is exactly typical, but I think nevertheless it sort of begins to cast doubt. So the two cases or the two traits that I have in mind are the ability to identify and detect facial features, identify conspecifics, and kin, that kind of thing. That is purportedly the role of an area in fusiform cortex called the fusiform face area. I'm sure you all are familiar with this idea. Then we also have the visual word form area, which is a neighboring region of the fusiform gyrus that has also been a favorite example of those who favor a modular view of the brain. And it's supposed to be a dedicated processor of letters. So it's sort of a lexical processor. And this is a pretty good candidate for a structure that realizes a modern type 2 function for the obvious reason that writing is only, say, 4,000 years old, maybe a little more. So reading is a trait that is pretty recent. And I think if you compare reading to piano playing, it seems like it's, and this is in part just an intuitive judgment, but it seems like it's a strong candidate for one of those paradigm type 2 cases. It of course is built on the back of precursors, and so it's not that it appears magically out of nothing. I mean, the capacities we have that allow us to read are more ancient than reading itself, but it is a stark transition. It's a remarkably new thing that we can do. Okay. Here's a fun brain picture. The picture doesn't matter so much, except to say that people have traditionally thought that the fusiform face area is lateralized on the right side. Siri is talking to me, sorry. It's lateralized on the right side, and then the visual word form area is lateralized on the left side of the fusiform gyrus, and they're both sort of in the middle. What's interesting, though, is that in the last decade, people have figured out that the two regions actually compete for cortical terrain during development. And this was discovered by scanning illiterate subjects. So in people who can't read, the area of the fusiform gyrus that displays a bias towards facial information actually includes the region that we would otherwise call the visual word form area. And so Stan DeHaan has tried to explain this effect by saying that we just had a simple sampling bias, and that in the vast majority of cases, we were scanning graduate students who are highly literate, and so it seemed like the fusiform face area was lateralized, but actually the ancient form of the structure that realizes our capacity to detect faces is bilateral. And only once we learned how to read was that structure usurped for the purposes of reading, or at least part of it was. Okay, so what is the upshot of this example? If there's developmental competition for cortical terrain between type 1 and type 2 functions, then the distinction between modern and ancient neural architecture, not the distinction between modern and ancient functions, but the architecture that underlies those functions, becomes blurry. And if that kind of competition is, if this is not the only example, if that kind of competition is actually easy to find, then we would definitely have reason to doubt the bells and whistles hypothesis. Okay. So if you were a defender, if you're an evolutionary psychologist and the defender of something like the bells and whistles hypothesis, you might say this. You might say, look, to find the architectural distinction between structures that support the ancient functions and the modern ones, we shouldn't look to local regions of cortex. Instead, we should look to more distributed structures like networks. And I'm going to come back to that thought in a minute. Okay. So the bells and whistles hypothesis, if that's correct, I think that we have to expect some form of localization. We can't give up on localization altogether. I think the two claims, the two implications that I mentioned about the bells and whistles hypothesis earlier, one, that it implies some degree of modularity, and two, that it implies some degree of rigidity, I think those are almost equivalent to, or maybe they entail, that localization is necessary. If you didn't have any kind of localization, then you definitely couldn't have that metaphorical protective barrier I was talking about, whereby the ancient traits are unable to be modified by the task demands of the modern world. Okay. As I think everyone here is well aware, there's been a lot of discussion in philosophy about the implications of about the localization debate in cognitive neuroscience, and about the implications of these brain imaging meta-analyses. And if you look for what I've previously called task-bound functions, specific behavioral functions, or really specific cognitive functions, and you look you do a region-based imaging experiment, then you're going to get both functional multiplicity and probably functional degeneracy, one-to-many mappings and many-to-one mappings. So maybe in general you get many-to-many mappings between cortical regions and cognitive or behavioral functions. And if you have rampant many-to-many structure function mappings, that puts some pressure on the thesis that neural functions can be localized at all. So if the bells and whistles hypothesis is going to withstand that data, we have to revise the way that we're thinking about structure and function. And I guess there's more than one way to do that. So a bunch of authors, maybe some of you included, have suggested that you can recover a sort of more moderate or a simpler structure to function mapping if you reconceptualize what you mean by function. So if you describe function in sort of more abstract terms, then maybe you can recover a one-to-one or something closer to a one-to-one mapping. I don't think this will work for someone who is defending the bells and whistles hypothesis on the grounds of sort of traditional evolutionary psychology. And this is because something like domain specificity is required. The functions have to be defined with respect to cognitive and behavioral ends, because the whole point is to say that human nature is a set of solutions to behavioral and cognitive problems that we faced in the Pleistocene. So if you go really abstract with the notion of function, then I think the evolutionary psychology view of human nature will lose its content. Okay, so one thing you can do, which I just discussed, is changing your conception of function in order to recover something like a simpler mapping. But of course, another option is to change your conception of structure. So Peter Carruthers, in his very good book, The Architecture of Mind, suggests something along those lines. So he says that domain specificity is necessary for most evolved functions. So he's sticking with that view that the neural functions that constitute human nature they're not abstract. They have specific input conditions, and they have to be described in behavioral and cognitive terms. So you couldn't, for example, appeal only to what sometimes are called intrinsic functions. However, regional localization is not required. You don't have to think of cortical regions as the relevant kind of structure. Instead, domain-specific functions can be realized in really highly complex and distributed networks. And maybe those networks are so complex that we can't detect them very well, and then that means that the meta-imaging analyses, the meta-analyses of imaging data are perhaps less relevant, or at least less of a threat. So I think that's all very reasonable. But now I'd like to introduce a new idea, which won't be new to most of you, but Michael Anderson's idea of neural reuse. And it's not really only Michael Anderson's idea. This is an idea that a bunch of people have discussed. But my claim is that if something like neural reuse is correct, then Carruthers' appeal to that network level, change your conception of structure so that it's something distributed and networked, that will not suffice as a way of defending the bells and whistles hypothesis. Okay, so now what does neural reuse say? Well, there it is on the screen. Most cognitive and behavioral tasks are realized by transient neural partnerships between local cortical regions. These partnerships emerge from a real-time process of neural search, and the coalitions that emerge from the search process can be dissolved as new task demands appear. Okay, so two points about this idea of neural reuse. First of all, it's attractive because it solves what Stan DeHaan, who's there on the screen, has called the paradox of reading. If brain architecture is genetically specified, how could a brain area, how could a local cortical region become sort of specialized for a task that only appeared recently in evolutionary history? And the answer to that question is that each cytoarchitectural region, so each region defined by cell type, will have a unique and genetically specified bias. It can contribute only to certain kinds of information processing roles, but it'll hook up with a bunch of different cortical regions on different occasions, and depending on the exact network that it happens to be contributing to at a time, it'll be able to realize a bunch of different tasks. So it has specialization, but it also has multiplicity of function because it gets reused many times with a different network of partners. Okay, that's the first point. And the second point is that the many-to-many structure-function mappings that we were worrying about a minute ago are going to be explained by changes in effective connectivity. Okay, so the idea of transient structures that was part of the definition of the theory of neural reuse is maybe a strange idea. I think that if it's true, then neural structures, in the relevant sense of the term that I've been using, are themselves transient. So what is the sense of that term? Neural structures are the structures that will realize domain-specific functions that compose human nature. And you may be asking yourself, well, how can a structure, you think of something hard and permanent when you think of structure. How could a structure be transient in the brain? To make the puzzle a little bit clearer, imagine that there is no such thing as neurogenesis, no such thing as synaptogenesis, and imagine that all learning was Hebbian learning. So that means whenever you acquire a capacity for a new, to deal with a new task, you're just changing the strength, the potentiation of synaptic connections, but the basic architecture of the brain never changes at all. The wiring diagram of your brain does not change. If that were true, then I think neural reuse could not be true. I think that would mean that neural structures are not transient. But we know that that picture I've just sketched is definitely false. There is a lot of synaptogenesis. We now have good photon microscopy that bears that out. Dendritic spines can grow and disappear on the order of hours, and new boutons form regularly. There's all kinds of evidence for this, and I haven't put all that evidence into the talk because that's not really the point. So despite the evidence we have that there is such a thing as sort of rewiring on the fly, we don't know all that much about exactly how it works. Michael Anderson suggests that it may have something to do with volume transmission, but that's somewhat speculative, and I'm not really sure how it works. What matters is that the brain can rewire itself on relatively short time scales. And so if that's right, and neural structures really are transient, then I think the bells and whistles hypothesis is likely to be false. So why is that? Well, transiently reused structures are going to participate in many effective networks, many functional networks. Now, pick any network that realizes an ancient function, an old one. As reuse becomes more and more common, then the probability that such a network shares at least one node with a network that also realizes a modern function is going to increase. Right, so the more reuse, the more recycling that happens, the more ancient networks and modern networks are going to be partially overlapping. And if partial overlapping is sufficient to show that the barrier that the bells and whistles hypothesis is looking for is blurred, then I think neural reuse shows that the bells and whistles hypothesis is false. Okay. Yeah, I guess you could summarize that line of thought by saying that neural reuse predicts that neural mechanisms, their underlying ancient and modern functions, are thoroughly intertwined. Okay. I don't actually know how much time I've taken, but I'm getting towards the end.
It's okay with the time.
It's okay with the time? Yeah. Okay, good. All right, so, yeah, all right. So now I want to try to bring what we've said so far back to the question about human nature. So recall that according to evolutionary psychology, the set of traits that comprise human nature, sort of by definition, can't include recently acquired type 2 traits like reading. However, if the bells and whistles hypothesis turns out to be false, then you might think the brain doesn't offer us a mechanism by which those traits, by which the ancient traits can be cordoned off or sort of protected from the task demands of the modern world. So modern humans developing in an environment that's novel and I think in some cases you could say radically different from the ancient environment in which we evolved. The demands of that modern world are going to sort of invade. They're going to leave a mark on every structure in the relevant sense of structure. Okay. So what can we conclude from that? Well, I think what I'd like to avoid straw manning evolutionary psychologists. So if we were to begin with an account of human nature that's extremely modular and sort of extremely and implausibly nativist, then maybe the failure of the bells and whistles hypothesis is going to be unsurprising. But let's take a look at a more sophisticated conception. So Edouard Machery has this, what he calls a nominalist conception of human nature. And this is not unique, really, to his view. There are a bunch of other philosophers who have advocated a similarly, sort of watered down conception of what human nature is. And according to this view, human nature is the set of properties that humans tend to possess as a result of the evolution of their species. And this does not, one of the important things about this view of human nature is that the traits that comprise human nature don't have to be unique to humans. They can be shared with other animals. Okay. So let me just dig into that central phrase, tend to possess, as a result of. So Machery says that as a result of is to be cashed out in the following way. It means that it has an ultimate rather than proximate explanation in terms of evolutionary history. And that's to say something more substantive than merely that some trait has survived or persisted through evolutionary history. Rather, it's to say that evolution has directly influenced or shaped the relevant properties. And so I think if at least some, so he's trying to give us a relatively weak criterion for human nature. So I think the best way to interpret this is to say that if at least some properties of the mechanism that underlies a particular cognitive or behavioral function are shaped by evolutionary history, are there because of our evolution, then Machery's criterion is satisfied. And in particular, this is compatible with the observation that social learning and cultural transmission have played some role in shaping the developmental trajectory of the underlying mechanism. So this is not a strong view. It's not at all implausible. Okay, so tend to possess was the other phrase I wanted to analyze, and that just means that most but not all members of the species have to possess the trait. Okay, so remember, neural reuse says that cultural innovations like reading are the result of a transient affective network. It also says that the processing characteristics of each local circuit or region is going to be highly constrained by evolutionary considerations. It's going to be genetically specified to some degree. And I think that fact shows that, according to neural reuse, cultural innovations like reading satisfy Machery's as a result of condition. Okay, so that means reading, our capacity for reading is a result, on this view, of our evolutionary history. Second sort of demographic point, I just looked it up, and UNESCO says that, I think this is from 2016, says that 86% of the world's adult population is indeed literate. So that satisfies the second condition, the tends to condition. And so the conclusion there is that it is in human nature to read books. And that's interesting. Certainly that's not what evolutionary psychologists had in mind. And it's worth saying that this is to be distinguished from the many philosophers who have argued that human nature is somehow an incoherent idea. I don't think it's incoherent, and my views on exactly what human nature is are not settled. But the argument I'm giving is just that if neural reuse is true, it seems like human nature is the kind of thing that can be updated not only by means of genetic selection, but also by means of development in novel environments. So it's in human nature to read and maybe to hold webinars as well. Or that's probably not true, but down the road. Okay, so here's just a concluding slide. This is trying to summarize the reasoning that I've gone through at a fairly high abstract level. So basically I've said that if human nature is both old and canalized, as evolutionary psychologists have suggested, then there's got to be some way that it's protected from the task demands of the modern world. Because if it weren't protected, then the task demands of the modern world would reshape it, and we would get the conclusion which I've just drawn. Now that protection must be realized somehow in the brain. I mean, where else? Neural reuse says that no such protection exists. Therefore, human nature can indeed be invaded by the task demands of the modern world. And that's all I've got.